This is More Than Therapy podcast. More than therapy. This is More Than Therapy. More Than Therapy podcast. This is More Than Therapy. More Than Therapy podcast. This is More Than Therapy podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of More Than Therapy. Today we have Mr. Tony Hardman, and we're going to talk about Not Quite Zen. He is the CEO, web designer, etc. of Not Quite Zen. But let's talk about Tony. Tony Hardman is the founder of Not Quite Zen, a blog and podcast focused on providing mental health support from the perspective of the survivor. Tony has struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and anger since he was a child. Cursed with a family history of mental health issues and early childhood trauma, finding a path to calm with a journey 35 years in the making. Now he shares an experience through Not Quite Zen in hopes that he can help others learn how to get better, faster. Mr. Tony Hardman. Hello, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for that amazing intro. I really appreciate it. I'm super happy to be here and happy to talk to you today.
Indeed. Tony, tell us about your journey and how you got to the place of Not Quite Zen.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, really. And like I said, it's something, 30 plus years in the making. I'm 39 now, but I really didn't start getting better until I was about, 30, 35. So, when I look at mental health, it's like I started having problems. I had issues as a child. My father, he basically abandoned me as a baby. He didn't want to be a dad. My parents were incredibly young. And so that created, a lot of issues growing up, feelings of abandonment. And I wouldn't really realize how that would affect me until later on in life. But for the most part, aside from that, I was a relatively happy-go-lucky kid. But one of the problems was we moved around a lot. And around about fourth grade, I moved from Colorado to Ohio, where I was really happy, and it just did not go well for me. And I entered like a really bad depression. And I asked my parents to take me to therapy, and my mom took me to one session, and I found it very helpful. But she never took me again because, somebody at her work was like, oh, they don't need, this is back in the early 90s. So there's a very big stigma with therapy and mental health. So they were like, oh, he doesn't need therapy, just take him to do something fun once a month. And my mom listened to him because that kind of advice people gave all the time back then. And I didn't get the help that I needed. And so I stayed depressed and sad. And especially in high school, that was really prevalent. I was very suicidal. I caught myself at times. And I even went to my dad one day and I was like I want to kill myself. And him being, very evangelical at the time, like very religious, was like, if you kill yourself, I won't go to your funeral. So that was kind of like another cry for help where I didn't get help. But it wasn't all bad. And I think that's kind of an important thing with mental health is it's like it ebbs and flows, right? Maybe not the same. It's not the same for everybody. But for me, it kind of ebbed and flowed. But there was a constant state of depression. So And I'll try to encapsulate this a little bit shorter, but when I got to college, I finally got in therapy, but I was kind of in and out throughout school. I was luckily able to kind of maintain halfway decent mental health through being really physically active, because that's really important. But, in my early 20s, as I became a father and a husband, there was just a lot of anger issues, a lot of depression, ton of anxiety. And, I went to therapy off and on, but nothing really quite stuck. And so one day, I was in my 30s and I asked my therapist, I was like, does this actually work? Does anybody ever get better? And her response was, yes, I know, because it worked for me. But at the time, it's a therapist saying that. So you kind of take it with a grain of salt. I didn't fully believe it because I was only getting better to a point. And then eventually I found, recommended by my therapist, acceptance and commitment therapy, which taught me about psychological flexibility. And it made me able to overcome, especially, my anxiety and my depression. And that's not to say that I don't still get those things from time to time, but they're nowhere near as bad. And that's why, my podcast and my blog is called Not Quite Zen. So through ACT, I learned how to, instead of changing my thoughts, accept my negative thoughts and make space for them, overcome them and ease them. And a lot of that we can talk about more today.
Indeed. When you said that you were having depression and suicidal thoughts, what kept you from going into the darkness? What kind of wellness tools did you have at the time? And what wellness tools are you using today in order to address your wellness and recovery?
That's such a great question, especially the second part about what tools I'm using today. But I'll start with the first part of your question. So I would say it's shifted depending on how old I was. As a teenager, I would say mainly it was fear of pain that kept me from doing it. It was as simple as that. I was scared of the pain that would come if I tried to do it. That was really what kept me. But I was miserable, and I'm sure other people can relate. It's a miserable existence. And then the handful of times I felt that way as an adult, I could usually tell, and I also had my wife there to help me when I was getting really bad. And so I would, if I wasn't in therapy, I would make a call or call the suicide hotline. Like, I'm a veteran from the Army. And so, like, there's a veteran suicide hotline. So I would reach out to those resources. I was strong enough to do that. And I would say in my adult years, it was more not like this strong desire to want to end my life, but definitely I don't care if I die. I don't really want to live type situation. And then to the second part of your question about what I do now, like, that's so important because your journey never ends. Like, you're gonna have bad days, so you have to build a mental health routine, like, mental health into your daily routine to make sure that you stay on top of it, because it's very easy to slip when you don't do those things. Like, so for me, it involves trying to eat healthy. It involves getting some physical activity every day, which is really, really important. And I constantly make sure I meditate once a day. And for me, it's usually, before I go to bed, because with meditation and mindfulness, it's really about connecting to the present moment, because that's a big problem with anxiety. You're either like worried about something you did in the past, or you're concerned about something that may or may not happen in the future, and you ruminate on these thoughts. But when you meditate and you connect to like the present moment and live in the present, you're safe in the present. So even if it's only for 10 minutes, like, you can have a world of calm that's peaceful and just existing. And it's not something that you can do just right away. It does take a little bit of practice, but I find it to be very effective.
You have a great outlook on life, and you said that you didn't really get clarity regarding wellness until your 30s. Can you tell us about the suffering that you did and the impact it might have had on relationships or even yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, for myself, it was a lot of, negative self-talk, the things that people tell themselves all the time. I'm not good enough. I'm not good looking enough. I'm not smart enough. I'll never be as good as that person, that sort of thing going on all the time. And with, like, in periods of depression, it's like finding the energy to get out of bed. Uh, you know, and a big thing for me, and I think for a lot of people that comes along with anxiety and depression, is anger. In fact, my nickname in high school was Angry Tony, because I was so angry all the time. So, in terms of being an adult, that looked like throwing plates against the wall, punching holes in the wall, you know, displays of anger, yelling at my kids, things like that.
Mental health is there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health. How did you overcome the stigma associated with mental health? And was that a factor? I know you said that was a factor in your youth that impacted your ability to get the help early on. Imagine
Mhm.
if your mom really addressed your mental health in your teens, where you could be today. But we can't live in the past.
Right.
But how do we as a society, or even you in your work, how do you help people remove the stigma associated with mental health?
That's such a really good question. And I like what you said about, the past, because I think that's important too, right? We can't dwell on the things that we did. I think forgiveness and acceptance is a really important part of the healing journey. So, like, I don't hold animosity towards either of my parents, or any of my three parents, I should say, because I'm adopted. Um, but yeah, I think the stigma when I was younger was more forced upon me. It wasn't a internal thing of I don't want help. It was society saying you don't need help. And I think those are kind of two different things. And I think they both can be at play. I think for a lot of men, it's don't be a sissy. Boys don't cry. You're fine. It's not that big of a deal. Right. I think that's very common. Or the other side, what I affected was you don't need therapy. Medication doesn't really help. Like, you should go do something fun once a month. Right. Like I said earlier, to make it better. So like I think that's how historically it has been a problem. I will say it does seem like it's getting better. For better or worse, more and more celebrities and people are talking about mental health. And I especially think coming out of this pandemic, people are very much aware of like how it has affected them mentally. So it's more prevalent now. But no matter what, it's always going to be suffering in silence if you don't speak up. Because it's not like when you break your leg. People can say, "Oh, he has a broken leg. Let me help him. Let me get out of his way." People don't view it that way. And that I think is still a problem. And I think that will probably continue and always be a problem, is because it's the silent disease. If unless somebody can see it, it's very hard for people to be compassionate about it, especially people that don't really know you. And also, it's hard to be open about, especially in terms of like, if you're at work and you're, hey, like having a really tough day, if your boss is not super understanding with it, like you can't take mental health day. You can't be vulnerable and express that that's going on. So I think we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go.
Indeed, indeed. And that's a very, very valid point. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Anxiety, depression, it seems to be at a I don't know if it's at an all-time high, but we are more aware of it, mainly through social media, regular media, and our interactions with people with day to day. People are suffering, but people often don't have the resources to address their suffering. I know that
Yeah.
you've assisted people regarding this through a program called the Burnout First Aid. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Burnout first aid is kind of a concept that I stumbled upon, and I'll tell the story about it. So a couple years ago, it was not too far into 2020, but we were getting pretty cooped up. So we're like, let's plan a vacation. Let's go to the beach with our family. And we did that. And after a week at the beach, I was just as stressed out, if not more stressed out than I was before I left. And I was like, man, like I'm still so stressed out. Like I don't want to work. I'm just really burnt out right now. But I think one thing that's really important for people to remember is that there's a really strong connection between, for me, the outdoors and mental health. So my brother got me into backpacking, and we went backpacking for a weekend up in Pennsylvania. And when you're backpacking in, a national forest, a lot of times you don't have cell service. So for 2 days, I didn't have any phone service. The only thing that I could focus on was staying alive by making sure that I was watching the markers on the trail and walking and just going forward. And it was the most like rehabilitating, refreshing 2 days of my life. And it was funny because when I got back into civilization, my phone, when it got service, it blew up. I had like a million notifications. And then you realize like how unimportant a lot of those things are. So like that was kind of the core of the idea of burnout first aid. And there's ways that you can replicate that in your own life, depending on what your interests are. There's a whole process to it. If you Google burnout first aid, you can learn about the whole process. You'll see my post there. But in a nutshell, what it is it really takes 2 or 3 days. Excuse me. It really takes 2 or 3 days, and you have to completely disconnect. So tell your boss you're going to be unreachable. The best way to do it would be to go to a cabin or somewhere where you're not going to have cell phone service. But you can also do it at home. You get a lock box, you lock your device in a box, you put it away for the weekend, you unplug your router. You can have a friend over, but they need to be people who are supportive, and they also need to agree to the rules. Their phones need to be in another room. They can't have them either. And you can do things where you connect to the present moment, right? Like playing a board game. You can even watch a movie as long as it's a movie that's, positive and uplifting and it's going to improve your mood. But when you're done watching the movie, unplug your router again. So it's doing activities that connect to the present moment and create, community and connection with the people that you love. It's being completely disconnected from the rest of the world. And I think that's a really great way. You will be amazed at how much it will decrease your levels of stress in the course of just a few days. Now, I'm not saying this is a cure for burnout. By no means. I think there's a lot of things that have to happen to get through that, but it certainly can be a reprieve. And so that's kind of where that idea came from.
It's a great concept, a great, great concept. I think society as a whole would have a lot of difficulty with doing it to that doing it to that degree because they're so connected to their social media. They're so connected to the devices. It's almost like they don't know how to interact
Yeah,
outside of that.
that's why it works. It works. If you can actually lock your device in a box and not touch it for 2 days, I promise you will feel better. And that's why I said it's better if you can go somewhere where there's no cell phone service and stuff, so that temptation's not there. And there is in that process. If you look up burnout first aid, it explains what to do in case of emergency. You have to have those safeguards. But it really does work and make a huge difference.
Tell us about your website, your movement, Not Quite Zen.
Yeah, so it's a blog and it's a podcast. So you can search for Not Quite Zen wherever you listen to podcasts. That's kind of the main vehicle to connect with me. And then of course the blog is notquitezen.co. The idea is really interesting to me. So about 2 years ago, maybe not quite 2 years ago, I had started a new job. And the funny thing about progress and change in your life is sometimes you don't see the new you until somebody new to you sees that you. So, what I mean by that is, even though I've made all this progress and stuff, my friends from high school are always going to know me as Angry Tony. Like my wife, though she loves me and is accepting of me, there's going to be a part of her that's always going to know that person who was not, mentally strong, who was angry all the time and sort of thing. So, my boss, saw me as this person who was very calm, very even keeled, which would not have described me, for most of my life. And so at one point, I won an award, and she was kind of, talking me up and stuff. And she said, Tony, he's our master of Zen, all these things. And like, I didn't hear the rest of what she said, because when she said that, that kind of clicked in my mind. I'm like, I'm not. Well, it was like a disbelief. Like, is she really describing me right now? And I was like, oh yeah, like I guess I have changed. But I was like, really, like I'm not quite Zen. And I think that's the key. People are like looking to get rid of their anxiety, get rid of their depression, say goodbye to it forever. But like, it's just not possible. You can get significantly better. You can live a values based, fulfilling life, and you can cut depression and anxiety down to where like it doesn't have to overwhelm you. You can overcome it and you can get past it much, much quicker. But I think it's an important message that like it's okay to not be okay sometimes, and we have to stop beating ourselves up over that. So that's why it's called Not Quite Zen, because sometimes I'm not quite Zen. I'm not always chill. I lose my temper. I still get angry. I still get a little anxious sometimes, and I still get a little depressed sometimes. But I have the tools and my psychological flexibility toolkit to get past all of that.
Indeed, indeed. What inspired you to launch this? I know it's a better way to reach people, but what
Mhm.
made you say, let me invest in this podcast, let me invest in this blog in order to assist people with addressing their wellness and their recovery?
That's a good question. So I would say I've had the knowledge for a long time. So throughout my career, I've been in marketing and public relations for about 17 years. So I had a lot of that knowledge, and I've wanted to start like a podcast or a blog for a number of years, but I never found anything that I was like passionate enough about to continue doing it like day in, day out, and moving it forward until this happened, until this transformation in me happened, because I was like, man, like if I can get better, anybody can get better. And I know if you watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast when they interview people who've had success, they say those kind of things, and you're kind of like, yeah, like, but I wish, like, not me. I'm telling you, like, I was that person. I never thought it was possible. That's why I talk about the story where I asked my therapist, is this possible? And then I did it. And the crazy thing is, once you do something, the compounding effect is like insane. So let me give you a quick story about that, if that's okay. So, part of acceptance and commitment therapy is um, identifying your core values and then taking committed action to live those values. So, as an example, one of my strongest core value is to be a good husband and father. My dad wasn't there for me, so I want to be everything he wasn't. Right? I want to be a really good dad. So, a couple years ago, an opportunity came up to coach my son's soccer team. And like I played a little bit of soccer as a kid. Like I know a little bit about the sport, but I, probably not the best person to coach, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I was like, I don't know about this, but they really, really needed people. Like the season wasn't going to start. He wasn't going to be able to play. And I was like, man, I really want my son to be able to play. Like, I'm going to commit to doing this for him. So I signed up, even though I had a ton of anxiety about it. And this process I'm explaining right now is what I call brute forcing your anxiety. So I committed to do it, connected to my value of being a good dad. The day before my first practice, I was freaking out. Like, if you're someone who's had anxiety, it's like, for me, it's like being on top of a tall ladder and kind of like looking off and feeling like you're gonna fall. Well, that's how I felt before the first practice. My wife was, why are you doing this to yourself? She was almost to the point of like mad at me for putting myself in this position. And I was like, because I have to. I have to do it because it's so connected to a very strong value of mine. Then I went to practice and I got through it. And I had a few more practices. And then we had games. And I ended up being a great coach. We didn't lose an entire game that whole season. And then the next season in the fall, we lost 2 games and I had one of the best teams. And I know it's like a very small thing, like coaching a soccer team. And some people are like, what? That's not a big deal. Like, I'll go coach a soccer team. But for me, it was a big deal. And in doing that, I overcame my anxiety, or I brute forced it, as I like to say. And when you can do that, you can build upon that. So, now I'm like, I'll take on whatever. Like, I'm not going to let anxiety hold me back anymore. Even if it puts me in an uncomfortable position, I know, like, I'm going to connect it to a value and I'm going to take that action to move past it. And if you can find one small thing and get success in that, that's a huge catalyst for progress in your life.
Anxiety. I find that anxiety is at an all-time high. Like I said before, I have the diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. I don't think it's so generalized. It's definitely situational.
Mhm.
um, but I found that oftentimes anxiety is a monster, mostly in the mind. 90% in the mind. That is that what I'm thinking about the situation is drawing anxiety, which never manifests unless I let the anxiety make it manifest. Isn't it interesting how the mind works? You know what I'm saying? We
Yeah,
create our realities by the way we think.
for sure.
And you've been able to address anxiety. How? Like, what do you do to address your anxiety? One way you said is like when you were working with your son's soccer team,
Hmm.
brute force, getting into the fire, and
Yep.
boom. Once you was in the fire, it no longer impacted you to that degree, right? It wasn't as
Yep.
crippling because you were actually doing it and might have got what they call endorphins by doing it.
Yeah, it's crazy because like that one little thing, it reduced not just anxiety about things that I want to do or things I would be fearful to do in the past, but it reduced overall anxiety. So when you think about anxiety, I like to frame it in 2 different ways. So there's overcoming anxiety, which is the process I just explained, like the brute forcing your anxiety, or there's easing anxiety. And both are critically important. So if in ACT therapy, there's 6 core processes. And this is a big part of building a psychological flexibility toolkit, is understanding these processes. I'm not going to go through each one, but I will explain some of the concepts from it. So with easing anxiety, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. So it's, I'm having negative thoughts right now, or reoccurring thoughts throughout my mind. Well, there's a lot of different things that you can do. So number one, you can accept them. And so the way to do that is by making space. So you can kind of notice how the anxious thoughts are showing up in your emotion and in your physical body. So it's, you know, I'm feeling sad, or, I'm feeling tension in my chest, or that sort of thing. And then you take that a little bit further and you kind of, this is called the observing self. So you step back from it a little bit. You kind of try to step outside of your mind. And a way I like to explain this is like if you've ever played a video game and you're controlling the character and you kind of have them, walking around. It's like that. Instead of your mind controlling you, you kind of zoom out from it. You're this back perspective, like in a video game, and you're kind of analyzing your thoughts. So instead of I'm sad, it's I notice the emotion of sadness. And it's a really subtle difference, but it's kind of a way of detaching and disconnecting from that thought. Some other really, great strategies for easing anxiety is, of course, connecting to the present moment. And that's kind of how I started with these 6 core processes of psychological flexibility. Was not even meditation. It was mindfulness without meditation. So one exercise I love is called noticing. So like as you go through your week, through your day, try to pick out small moments of joy throughout it. And these can be really simple things. It can be a great cup of coffee. It can be a hug from a kid, petting your dog, just kind of noticing those little things that helps you connect to the present, and it also helps you build gratitude. And the more gratitude you have, scientifically, those studies have shown gratitude greatly increases joy and happiness because we're appreciative of the things that happen. And connecting to the present is important, as I discussed earlier, because anxiety is worry about the past or the future, things that may come. But if you're focused on the present, you're not going to worry as much. And then I'll finish with, some of the other really great strategies that I love are what they call cognitive diffusion in ACT therapy. But simply, it's kind of like unhooking from negative thoughts. And there's several different techniques to help you do that. So a couple that I really like are, reframing the thought. So instead of I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, or instead of saying I'm not good enough, it's I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. And there's a big disconnect. There's a big, difference between the way you're framing those things. Or it's you can, if you have like a reoccurring story, like if you're always telling yourself, I'm not smart enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not smart enough, reframe it as, oh, that's the I'm not smart enough story. Anxiety doesn't have to be this monster that you fight. It's actually helpful. Like it's a part of your brain, it's a part of your survival. So when something like that happens, if you have a recurring story that you're telling yourself, it doesn't mean it's factual because thoughts are not facts. But you can say, thanks, brain. Thanks for trying to protect me. But that's just the I'm not good enough story again. I'm going to let that go and I'm going to move on about my day. Right. And then the last one I'll say, which sounds silly, is saying your negative thought in like a silly voice. If you're like using a Cookie Monster voice and you're like, oh, I'm not good enough, it kind of disconnects you from it and it sounds funny and it helps the thoughts lose power over you. It's like a traffic light in your mind or a GPS. Your brain is trying to tell you to go all these different directions, but there's no road that way, right? It's telling you to turn right. There's no road to turn right on. You don't have to listen to it. And these are all techniques that you can develop through psychological flexibility and like ACT therapy.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for giving us those tools, those
Yeah.
strategies regarding reducing anxiety. Tony, I look to you for advice. How do you create a daily routine for mental health?
Yeah, so I think like there's a lot of ways that you can do that, and I think it's going to be different for everybody depending on where you are mentally. So I would say to start, just start small. So like I wrote a blog post. You can go to my site, and it talks about how to create a daily routine for mental health. But in a nutshell, it's first identifying all of those activities. Some of the things I just discussed, like noticing, or meditation or other mindfulness without meditation activities like taking a mindful walk, those kinds of things, and then incorporating them into your day. So like I said, for me, I think noticing is probably one of the best ways for people to start. It's just like go through your day and kind of notice those things. And then if you're disciplined enough, write down at the end of the day, okay, these are the things that I noticed, or these are the things that I'm grateful for. Write down the things that you're grateful for. And then at the end of the week, kind of look back and focus on how you feel. Like, how did that help you? Was it better? And if that activity works really well for you, then I would continue to do that activity. If not, then I would try something else. So for me, when I did the noticing, then that went into meditation. Meditation is great and people get overwhelmed by it. But if you can do it consistently, like 10 minutes a day, it doesn't even have to be 10 minutes, but if you do it every day for like 3 weeks, you'll be amazed, because at the 3-week mark, I was like finally able to shut down the thoughts in my brain enough to where I had like some clarity and some calm, and it really brought calm into my day. And another great thing about meditation is it teaches you like equanimity, which is this idea of basically just like being in the eye of a hurricane, like being very calm. Like things can be going on around you, but you don't have to like let them in. You don't have to let them affect you. So like the thing about meditation is people think, oh, you have to clear your mind. Well, you're not always going to do that. Sometimes it's just like accepting, okay, I'm thinking, like I'm thinking right now, like, and using like a visualization technique to try to like let those thoughts go. So it can be like, sometimes I'll visualize like a pop-up ad on a website and I'll X out of it mentally. Or, another popular one that they talk about in ACT therapy is leaves on a stream. So imagine your thoughts are leaves on a stream and let them flow on by. So like as you think, you can build it into your day. So like for me, a routine might look like wake up in the morning, eat a healthy breakfast, go for a walk at lunch, which is, physical activity is huge. And then I might listen to like on that Calm app, the Daily J, like a positive story for like 10 minutes. And then at night, like meditate before I go to bed, and then listen to like a bedtime story, a sleep story, because I use the Calm app a lot. And that's like my routine. And so it could be as simple as just like, I'm going to meditate once a day. And if that's all you need, great. So it's really individualized. But yeah, that post on my site kind of explains how to go through that process. It offers several different activities and a process for how to build it into your day.
Tony, a comment from the More Than Therapy Facebook page has a question for you if you are okay with answering it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
All right. A person from the More Than Therapy Facebook group says, Tony, how do I overcome fear of failing and achieving my goals?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of the things that we just talked about. When you can start detaching from negative thoughts, you're able to start making progress in your life. And also, I think like persistence is a huge key, right? For me, I went through therapy in college and I stopped. And I went through therapy as a young adult and I stopped. And I tried several different medications and I tried several different psychiatrists. I voluntarily went to anger management. So I never gave up, even though I was still in my mid 30s and asking my therapist, does this have to get better? I never gave up. And then I finally found something that worked for me. I finally found the right medication that worked for me. And I finally got better. And I was able to do that because I never gave up. And I'm really good now because I developed psychological flexibility. So that's kind of how you overcome fear of failure. And this is another post that I have on my website that you can look up. And then the part about achieving your goals is really funny to me because I learned this, a few years ago. People always focus on their goals, like I want to do this thing or I want to do that thing. But what they don't realize is like, if you achieve your goal, that's amazing. You're awesome. Good for you. But mentally, what happens then? Right. So an example I like to use is running a marathon. A lot of people have a goal of running a marathon. Like, cool. Like you run a marathon, you train for it for a year, the day finally comes and you do it and you're so proud of yourself. And that's amazing. And that can be a huge rush. And then the question can become, okay, what do I do now? Oh, well, I'm going to run another marathon. Great. So you're a runner. You run all the time. You run a marathon. That's a big part of your life. That's a big part of your identity. What happens if you break your leg? What happens if you're in a car accident and you can't walk again? Right? So then you could spiral out of control into a deep depression because that thing that you love, you can't do anymore. The difference is instead of identifying goals, you should be focusing on what are my values, right? So like my core value is being a good father, but in the case of a marathon runner, your value might be, I love physical activity and pushing myself to my physical limits. So if you break your leg or you can't walk anymore, you can pivot, right? You can still live that value. You still make choices every day to live that value. So you could go kayaking, you could get a hand cycle. There's other things that you can do. It doesn't have to all be tied into this goal of running a marathon. So to identify your value, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. One of the main things they'll ask you is, imagine your funeral. What do you want people to say about you? And that will usually surface your biggest core value because it makes you search for like, okay, what is this thing that I want to define my life? And then it goes back to that like value-based committed action. So like, okay, I know my value. And then it just every day, it's like, what action am I going to take towards living that value? And you're not going to live consistently within like your values 100% of the time, all the time. That's why it's not quite Zen. That's why it's okay to not be okay. But if you're doing the little things, it's not going to look like a curve that goes up. It's going to be like, step curve, up, like you've seen those charts that kind of like up and down, but it's an overall course of going up because you're making, choices toward those values. So, and then another way to surface values is on my website, there's a tool. I think if you Google Not Quite Zen core values tool, it'll come up. If not, you can find it on my site. It's just notquitezen.co/core-values-tool. It'll walk you through like 4 main areas of your life, like work. I don't know them all off the top of my head, but I think it's work, personal relationships, free time, and like growth. And I think there's another one, but there's like a list of values and you can pull them out and it'll send you an automated report. And then there's kind of a table where you can attach like these primary values and then you can mark down every week, like, okay, this is the committed action I'm going to take this week toward that value. And then you come back to it and you kind of evaluate how you did. And you can just, eventually you won't need the table anymore. Eventually you're just going to do this in your head. But that's how you overcome things and achieve stuff, is defining your values and then being persistent.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you, Mr. Tony, for offering us your insight regarding anxiety and depression alleviation through, wellness tools. I hope to learn more about Not Quite Zen. I joined your mailing list, so looking forward to getting those once a week mental health contents that I would definitely tell my clients about, for they can do the same. Tell my peers and my associates about, for they can do the same. Because
Awesome.
just looking at your website, looking at your blogs, listening to a couple episodes of your podcast, I definitely feel you have the skills. You definitely have the passion
For sure.
to empower and educate, and you do it in such a palatable way. I don't know if that word resonates with you. It just basically means you break it down so that it's more comprehensible, which a lot of professionals, clinicians tend not to do. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? These big
Right.
fancy words that have no meaning at all. You know what I'm saying? I'd
Mm-hmm.
rather hear the essence of it from somebody who's been through the fire instead of somebody who read a book about the fire.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important distinction. And look, I love therapists. I love psychiatrists. They're very important and they can make a huge difference in your life. But at some point, and especially in my journey, like, I was searching for someone else that struggled that I could connect to. And I'm like, if I can do this, like, I want to help other people do that. So, that's why it's like, if you talk to me, or, you subscribe to my newsletter, you listen to my podcast, you're getting it from that perspective. If you go to a therapist, they're never going to be like, I struggled with this, and this. Here's how I overcame it. They're not going to be that open and honest with you. And that's okay. I think, like, it has its place, but I think people often search for more. And that's kind of where I try to fill that gap.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Mr. Tony Hardman, regarding wellness and recovery. And please check out his website and learn more about him at notquitezen.co. Notquitezen.co. And join his mailing list. It's, like I said, it seems to be very informative, very educational and empowering, and broken down in such a way that you can get the meaning of it and understand it readily. Thank you, Mr. Tony, for your presence here on the More Than Therapy podcast.
Yeah. If I could just say one more thing. So
Please do.
I would just say, go wherever you want to go. Like, if you have podcasts, search for Not Quite Zen. Like he said, I've got my newsletter. You can go to notquitezen.co and sign up for that. But I highly recommend you do, because I am developing a psychological flexibility mastermind free class. It's going to be probably coming out around September, October. So if you get on the list, you'll be one of the first people to hear about that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Indeed, indeed. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Morning Therapy podcast, featuring interviews and thoughts of the days, and great, great interviews and discussions with people like Tony Hardman. You can subscribe to the Morning Therapy podcast any way in which you push play to listen to your favorite podcasts. Be well and be great.